So now that we've familiarized ourselves with the scenario that they've provided us for the Java section, let's move on to question 2. We are given the UML diagram for the class stop. The UML diagram always indicates the properties and methods that are required. We need to take careful note of the method and parameter names in the diagram. No additional public property or method should be created. So let's have a look at this UML diagram. We can see that there are 3 properties or 3 private properties, namely a string stop name, a string root codes, and an integer stop type. Now we have 4 public static class constants which are of type integer. So stop type cafe, stop type shelter, stop type express, and a stop type other. Then we have a look at our methods. We have a constructor method which takes in 4 parameters as indicated here. We have a get stop type name which returns a string. It takes in no parameters. We have a is part of root method which takes in a character and returns a boolean, and then we have a ToString method. So you should be very familiar with reading UML diagrams, right? You need to make sure that you read your UML diagrams carefully, firstly to declare your variables of the correct type, and then you need to look at the UML diagram to determine which variables and methods are public or private, right? So a private variable is indicated by this minus sign. A private variable means that it can be only accessed by the class which it is declared in, and a public variable can be accessed in that class and external classes as well. So take note of this because you will lose marks for declaring a variable or method as public when it should be private and vice versa. So now that we've read our UML diagram and we know which variables and methods need to be declared, let's do question 2.1 where we need to create a new class called stop. So let's go back into NetBeans, and to create a new class we're going to first create a new file, and then the file name should be the name of the class. So the class name is going to be stop, and NetBeans has provided us with a skeleton class. And then just another note, in this author section you will be advised to provide your exam number in each of the classes or files that you create. Right? So now we've already done 2.1 because we've created this class stop. We now need to do question 2.2 where we need to create 3 properties to store stop name, root codes, and stop type. So these are going to be global variables and they're not going to be declared in a method because they are properties, and as the UML diagram indicates, they need to be private. So the first one is a string called stop name, secondly a string called root codes, and then finally an integer to store stop type. So 2.2 is now done. 2.3 states we need to create 4 static class constants, cafe, shelter, express, and other with respective values. And we know that they need to be public. So the syntax for static class constants is the same, and basically what they mean by static class constants is that the value can't change, so they're essentially immutable. So this is going to be a public static final int, right? So here the static final means that they are class constants, and you should memorize the syntax in case it comes up in your exam. And then we need to go ahead and create the names which they created with the values that they have told us to. So to speed things up, I'm just going to paste this, and then we need a one called shelter with the value of 2, and then we need a express with the value of 3, and finally a stop type other with the value of 4. And this satisfies the requirements of 2.3. Question 2.4, we're being asked to create a constructor method which accepts 2 strings and an integer as parameters. The first 2 strings represent the name of the stop and the codes of the route that visit the stop. The integer represents the type of the stop. So there are specific requirements for this constructor method. The constructor should do the following. The 2 string parameters must be assigned. The value must be used to assign the values of stop name and route codes properties. So the syntax for a constructor method is standard. You should be familiar with it. It is the name of a constructor method is always the same as your class name. And then, as the UML diagram has stated, this constructor method needs to take in these parameters, right? And they need to be called, or the parameter names should be the same as what the UML diagram has stated. And then we can just fix the type here. So the first thing is that the 2 string parameters must be used to assign the value of the stop name and the route code's properties. So stop name is equal to in stop name. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the NetBeans autocomplete functionality, and you can access this by simply pressing Control space, right? And then stop route codes needs to be equal to in route codes. And in your assignment of the stop type variable, or there is conditions which you need to check for. So the integer used to represent the stop type must be one of the values of the static class constant. If the given integer parameter is not one of the static constants, then the stop type property should have its value set to stop type other. So we need to check that the in stop type property is either equal to 1, 2, 3, or 4. We can do this with an if statement, right? So if in stop type is less than or equal to 1, or in stop type is greater than 4, and this should be is less than 1, right? Or if it's greater than 4, then in stop type, then stop type should be set to the value of stop type other. If not, meaning that it is either equal to 1, 2, 3, or 4, then stop type is equal to in stop type. So because the static class constants that we are dealing with are integers, we can simply check bounds. So once again, if stop type is less than 1 or greater than 4, then we automatically set stop type equal to stop type other. We set stop type equal to 4. If not, we set stop type equal to the value of stop type of stop type. So this is only done when stop type is equal to 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then when you're coding, make sure to format your code as you go along so that it's easier for you to read. So now we've done 2.4. We need to move on to 2.5, which is to create a method called getStopTypeName that returns the name of the stop type depending on the value of the stop type property. So if stop type property is equal to stop type cafe, then we should return cafe. If not, if it's equal to shelter, we should return shelter. If it has the same value as express, then we should return express. And for any other value of the stop type property, the method should return other. So the method getStopTypeName is going to return a string, and it's going to be a public method. So public getStopTypeName takes in no parameters, and this is a string. Sorry, it returns a string, public string getStopTypeName, and now we need to check what the value of stop type is equal to, and we can do this using a switch statement or an if statement, right? So switch statement is just generally easier to read, and you should be familiar with the syntax. So in the case that stop type is equal to the value of stop type cafe, going to return cafe, and then we can just copy this 3 times and format it. If it's equal to shelter, we need to return shelter. If it's equal to express, we need to return express. And if it's equal to other, we need to return other. And then with switch statements, you always need to provide a default. So in the event that stop type is not equal to one of the 4 static class constants, you simply return other. And this should satisfy the requirements of question 2.5. Now we need to do 2.6, which is where we are required to create a method called isPartOfRoot that takes in a character. The method should return a boolean to indicate whether or not the stop is part of the root represented by the given character. So this is a public method which returns a boolean called isPartOfRoot, which takes in a character, and we're simply going to call that character x. So now we need a way to check if this character is part of our root codes. So if we circle back to the text file which they've given to us, we can see that a root code is going to be something like RB or RBY. So this method is likely going to take a character such as R or B, right? Then we need to check that the character which has been provided is part of the root code. So we can do this using the .contains method of the string type. So this is a built-in Java method which works with strings, and you can see that NetBeans gives us a prompt, and we can see that it takes a char sequence, which is basically another word for a string, right? So we know that this method returns a boolean. So basically what the contains method does is it checks if the given string is part of the main string. And if it is, it returns true. If not, it returns false. So we can then return this. We can make this the return of the is part of root method. We can see that this squiggly line here, because of incompatible types, where it says that a char cannot be converted to a char sequence. So we need a way to convert this char to a string or a char sequence, and we do that as follows. Whenever you need to convert a char to a string, you simply add an empty string to that char, and this then concludes the is part of root method. Now time for 2.7, where we need to create a ToString method that can be used to output a string representation of the stop instance that includes the stop name and the stop type name in this format. So the syntax for a ToString method is pretty standard. It's always going to be a public method, and it's always going to return a string and take in no parameters, and then we need to specify the return string, which is going to be the stop type name followed by the tab followed by the stop type or the stop name. And we know that if we want to get the stop type name, we're going to use the get stop type name method which we created early on. And then we need to add a tab to the string, and we can do that using the \t. This is one thing that you definitely need to know because it's easy marks. And if we wanted to add a new line, it's simply \n. So those are the abbreviations that you need to know. We need to add a tab followed by stop name, which is all right. And make sure that your formatting is exactly as the question has specified, or else you will lose marks, especially in your ToString methods.